Sony have now announced their new PlayStation 5 Pro, a $700 console that, yes, offers more power to console owners, but does so with no disc drive. Sorry physical media fans, Sony are saying not for you the sunlit uplands of AI-driven upscaling, advanced ray tracing and an upgraded GPU. What does Sony's bold pricing decision for the newly announced PlayStation 5 Pro augur for Nintendo's own successor console, its price and its announcement? Do Sony's choices make sense? What are the pressures they are facing that has led them to this decision? Do Nintendo have the same pressures and can they make different choices? As a rule, I'm not a major Sony watcher, I'm very much a Nintendo player. However, it's hardly possible to miss a major announcement like this, so settle in for a Nintendo Forecast deep dive on the impact of the PlayStation 5 Pro announcement. Firstly, let's be clear, even by historical standards and accounting for inflation, this price is very high. Viewers of my previous pricing video may remember this chart, which I have now updated. The blue and orange dots represent Nintendo's consoles prices over the years adjusted for inflation, but the grey dots represent the mass market competitor consoles from Sega, Sony and Microsoft. Inflation adjusted, this is the third priciest of the consoles here, which I grant you doesn't include the more obscure and off-the-charts pricey options like the 3DO or the Atari Jaguar, but those never seriously entered the market. Basically, the only pricier models for their eras were the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation 3. There are a few possible motivations for pricing this high. One is component costs, as suggested by Patreon member Efren, who, by the way, I also need to thank for making the suggestion for this video in the first place. In the case of a video game manufacturing process, it's gathering not just the chips that's important, but also the raw materials to make the chips that becomes expensive. S. McClure 3545 in the comments recently also pointed out that the Center for Strategic and International Studies have noted that China has begun putting export controls on substances such as gallium and germanium, which are used in electronic products. As far as I can tell, while some third-party Switch products use these metals, they are not utilized by Nintendo at present. Certainly neither appears in Nintendo's current smelting list, although they do make use of Chinese tantalum, cobalt, tin, tungsten and especially gold. The gold price is on a stratospheric rise at the moment, and so rare metal costs are likely to be big considerations for future systems. In the case of the PlayStation 5, while I'm no chemist, so don't take my word for it, but I have seen it reported that PlayStation 5 uses a liquid metal alloy called gallistan, comprised of gallium, indium and tin. With China being the largest gallium exporter in the world, you can bet Sony are looking very closely at their console design and perhaps even looking to expedite their next system so that they can try to get to a design with a less heavily squeezed set of components. Still, we don't know precisely what materials Nintendo might need, but given the prices of tin, gold and others, they will doubtly have their own pressures that they're considering. This is one thing, of course, that might nudge them towards a smaller form factor than we would otherwise expect, or alternatively, a higher price. In fact, Sony have already suggested that component costs are a problem for them. This February, IGN reported that Sony Interactive Entertainment's boss Hiroki Totoki commented that it's harder to shrink the PlayStation 5's die size. That's the size of the small piece of silicon on which the microprocessor is manufactured. The largest producers of silicon materials are still China, Russia and Brazil. Evidently, these kinds of costs are industry-wide issues that will affect Sony, Nintendo and likely Microsoft as well. However, there are other potential reasons why Sony may have felt that they could justify, or at least get away with, charging such a high price. They may have wished to inflation-proof the console, or they may be concerned that as a relatively niche product aimed only at the highest end of the market, the demand might not be high enough to get the kind of cost savings that mass production at a huge scale can generate. To guard against that, at least until they see what the market reaction is like, it is sensible in this case to price high to cover the costs. But also for Sony, why wouldn't they price high? Think about it. This is not a product that many people are likely to buy. It really is for the ultra dedicated pro gamers in the console space. and so it's not clear that many people would be vastly more likely to buy a console at $599 as opposed to $699. Let's say, and I have no idea if this is true, so don't take this as any kind of precise quote, but let's say that the PlayStation 5 Pro cost $550 to actually make. At $599, they're making $49 on each unit sold. At $699, they are making $149. I am massively oversimplifying to make the point here, but effectively, using this particular calculation, they would need a $100 price drop to shift 3 times as many PlayStation 5 Pros to be worth it, and that just doesn't seem very likely to happen. At least, the day one purchasers are going to be pretty resilient, whatever the price is. It may be that after some time Sony can drop the price if it becomes more of an option for more players. I also wonder if, to some degree, Sony know they're on to a bit of a loser with this one, and so puncturing right into the $700 ceiling now allows the PlayStation 6 to seem more reasonable if it is ultimately priced at the same rate or only marginally higher, $749 say. Think about it, this Pro version would have to be in development for years, but the PlayStation 5 era doesn't seem to have exactly lit up the skies over Sony towers, and COVID has hardly helped, meaning that a Pro version of a so-so console was always going to be a hard sell. But these consoles take so long to make, and did they really just want to scrap the project altogether? No. Instead, they shove it out the door, probably to a tepid reaction, but they crank the price up high to try to get the maximum return they can, given that it's already seemingly doomed to a rather limited reception. It's not the most noble strategy, but it does kind of make sense. This way they can cut their losses and move on without burning any of the developers who have been anticipating the Pro model and for some reason can't cut their development cloth according to the needs of the base model PlayStation 5. It also somewhat future-proofs them, as if they need to push the PlayStation 6 until 2027 or even 2028, they don't need to fear Microsoft stealing a march on them with a much more powerful iteration of the Xbox launching in, let's say, 2026 and gaining a significant first-mover advantage. Okay, so that's the strategy for Sony, but how does the House of Mario respond? And honestly, for Nintendo, I doubt much if anything will change in terms of strategy. Nintendo is fishing in a different pond, and they do their own thing anyway. However, I also think they will be quietly pleased with themselves. For one thing, I refer you back to the points I made in my recent pricing video, in which I observed that those generations where the market leader decided to price themselves way out ahead, the Saturn and the PlayStation 3, it was the plucky console that was just under the lead price that benefited, an effect called anchoring. Xbox Series X should be that console in theory, except for one thing, Microsoft seems not to have caught on in this generation. For another, from Nintendo's point of view specifically, Microsoft barely registered in Japan, and finally everyone knows that Microsoft too will be looking to move on from this generation in due course, and so the arrival of the PlayStation 5 Pro isn't so much a fillip for the Series X as a reminder of its mortality. Let's face it, if Microsoft were super competitive, Sony would feel pretty nervous pushing out a $700 system. But Microsoft just don't appear to have it at the moment. Players are going to be looking for where the puck's going to be, and where it's going to be is at Nintendo's feet. And here's the thing, they have a lot of wiggle room. $449 may sound expensive, but it would still be relatively cheap in this market. Heck, $499 would still be relatively cheap against this kind of competition. Just like the PlayStation in 1995 and the Xbox 360 in the mid-2000s, they don't need to be cheap outright. In fact, those consoles were still really expensive, but they looked more reasonable by contrast. If anything, I don't think Nintendo wants to be perceived as competing on price. Don't get me wrong, it's advantageous to them to be cheaper, and by dint of being a less powerful console, they will be cheaper than other options on the market. But if people are talking on launch day about this being a cheap system, I think they will be frustrated that the conversation isn't about the quality of their product, and perhaps they might feel concerned that they have undervalued what they are offering. They really need a price that doesn't just cover their costs now, but is future-proofed in a very uncertain market. This is why I'm feeling ever less optimistic about $399, and I think $449 makes a lot of sense for them. One thing's for sure, if they do go with $399, it would be an extremely aggressive move. They could probably justify this as a loss leader for their new titles if they do have a very robust lineup to back that up. Nintendo have never, for preference, wanted their consoles to be a loss leader for their software, but it is to their advantage to have this transition happen as fast as possible, given they do not have a secondary console backing them up at this time, and so they can get back to their position as soon as possible where their current console has a massive install base of players buying their games. If they do indeed have a very robust game lineup over the next few years and can drop major hit titles every few months going forward, they may feel comfortable enough with their game lineup that they can absorb a degree of the console cost. That strong game lineup is quite possible with 3D Mario, Mario Kart, Pokemon Legends, Pokemon Gen 10, Splatoon 4, and maybe Smash Bros, Animal Crossing, a Pokemon Gen 5 remake, a new 2D Mario, and a Zelda Ocarina of Time remake potentially, all at least plausible within the first 2 or 3 years. 3 or 4 of those a year, plus a healthy diet of the mid-sized titles, and I could foresee a loss-leading console still being a savvy move. All the same, I think Nintendo would rather price a bit higher now and hold their price than price competitive but be vulnerable to market shocks over what they will hope will be a decade-long lifespan for the new system. However, it's not just price that is eyebrow-popping in the PlayStation 5 Pro announcement, but the decision to ditch physical media entirely. This is clearly another way that Sony intend to earn back the development cost of the titles, as the margins on digital games are so much higher. The thing is, if they can persuade their core fan base, the most dedicated players in their ecosystem, to go all digital, then while those people may not be large in number, they represent a disproportionate number of game sales, as they're more likely to buy titles. While preservationist movements are a thing, and personally I'm quite skeptical about an all-digital future, once people make the change, they seldom seem to return, and so this effort to nudge people forward is probably the equivalent of how Apple ditched all ports on its Macs except for USB and then USB-C for long periods in order to force the industry to move towards a new standard. This aggressive move from an industry leader had the positive effect of speeding up the obsolescence of any number of weird and wonderful ports. From Sony's point of view, they may feel that they're doing the industry a favour by pushing it down a route it was always going to go down. I think though it's less likely that Nintendo will buy what Sony are selling. Yes, Nintendo makes a lot of money from digital titles, but they benefit a lot from people, especially children, being able to go into a physical store and see Mario smiling down from the shelves. There is also a respect for long business partnerships, and Nintendo has had long business partnerships with a lot of retailers. While a digital-only system does seem inevitable at some point, and it's completely possible the new system could have a digital-only option, especially if they're pushing into the deeper end of the pricing pool, my hunch is that it's far more likely that this won't be the Switch successor, but if anything, a fourth and final version of the Switch. If they can run down their stocks of Switch titles by changing to digital distribution only for the Switch legacy games, they can subtly push people to the new system and save on warehouse space into the bargain. But what do you think? I'll be continuing my series on the Switch successor tomorrow, so check out some of these videos in the meantime, and thank you as ever to everyone who likes, comments, shares, subscribes, and checks out the Patreon. Take care, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.